Tonight, Year 2 begins.
They will go for years just to kind of exhaust our patience and exhaust the resources.
On the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a new chapter in the deadly war. Plus, revival spreads. The spark at Asbury University, igniting a nationwide movement of God.
Did you make a difference?
And devastation brings desperation.
And trying to rob as much as they can. People is getting desperate.
Danger in Turkey in the earthquake's aftermath. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The dawn of a second year of war. Welcome to Faith Nation from our studio in Washington, D.C. I'm John Jessup. Well, the one-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine marked by a new $2 billion aid package from the United States and a 12-point peace plan from China. The true cost of the war, though, measured by the reality of loss. Tens of thousands have died, millions are homeless, and much of the country now lies in ruins. CBN national security correspondent Caitlin Burke joins us with the latest. Caitlin, a year later, and people are still inspired by Ukraine's defiance and resilience.
That's right, John. Vladimir Putin's war has exacted a terrible toll in death and destruction. But as the conflict now enters its second year, Ukraine's president pledges to push for victory.
Головніше – наша людина.
We're strong, we're ready for anything, we will defeat everyone because we are Ukraine. That was the message from President Volodymyr Zelensky this morning, and it's one being echoed by the West.
President Putin failed. Ukraine stands, and NATO and the EU stand with Ukraine.
Still, Russia shows no signs of backing down. Adrian Kubicki, Counsel General for the Polish government in New York, predicts tougher times with a new chapter in the war.
Obviously, for Putin, this is something also about saving face after 1 year of, let's put it this way, unsuccessful invasion of Ukraine. He must finally make some progress, which means that it will be very harsh for Ukrainians.
The invasion has already proven costly for Ukraine. Bombed out power stations, businesses, and homes have left many without electricity, food, and water. 8 million Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries, and more than 5 million are internally displaced. The Ukrainian government reports as many as 40,000 civilians and 10,000 troops have died in the conflict. Other estimates put the number at more than 100,000 killed. Russia reports 6,000 of its soldiers dead, but other estimates place that number much higher. This morning, President Biden holding a virtual meeting with G7 leaders and President Zelensky to continue both coordinating support for Ukraine and efforts to hold Russia accountable. Today, the U.S. announcing another $2 billion military aid package for Ukraine, along with a new round of sanctions against those supporting Russia's military. Meanwhile, China calling for a ceasefire and offering up a proposed peace plan.
Any proposal that can advance peace is something that's worth looking at. We're taking a look at it. But, you know, there are 12 points in the Chinese plan. If they were serious about the first one, sovereignty, then this war could end tomorrow.
During today's UN Security Council meeting, Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling on members to push for just and endurable peace in Ukraine.
Members of this council should not fall into the false equivalency of calling on both sides to stop fighting or calling on other nations to stop supporting Ukraine in the name of peace. No member of this council should call for peace while supporting Russia's war on Ukraine and on the UN Charter.
No one can predict when this war will end or who will be the victor. But Secretary Blinken pointed out there is one major difference between the two sides, and he thinks it tilts the scales in Ukraine's favor. Russia is fighting for conquest, Ukrainians for their homeland. John?
Good point to remember. Caitlin Burke reporting. Well, here with us now is John Hardy, Russia Program Deputy Director at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. John, welcome. You know, first off, as we enter a new chapter of this war, many had feared a possible escalation of Russia militarily in Ukraine. We didn't see that happen today. However, do you see darker days ahead?
Well, I think for Ukraine, every day is a dark day, but I think there's some hope in that supported by Western aid and and the bravery of Ukrainian troops, Kyiv is going to try to launch a major counteroffensive sometime this spring. That's when it's widely expected. And I think that there are solid prospects that Ukraine can retake more territory.
Western leaders have essentially dismissed China's 12-point proposal for peace. The NATO Secretary General quoted as saying China has no credibility on Ukraine as it calls for a comprehensive ceasefire. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I really look pretty skeptically at that Chinese peace plan. I just don't see how it could be credible when we know that China is simultaneously supporting Russia through non-lethal aid, allowing Russian shell companies to circumvent Western export controls through China, and now, according to U.S. intelligence, considering supplying lethal aid. So to me, it just seems like a ploy to sort of paint China in a favorable light, especially given that China really wants to maintain good economic relations with Europe.
On this one-year anniversary, John, we've seen the Western world largely coalesce and come together. We see a strength in NATO. We see sanctions against Russia. However, India's decision to abstain from the UN vote condemning Russia, not to mention the joint military drill between Russia, China, and South Africa. John, do these indicate a growing global divide over Ukraine 1 year later?
Well, I'm not sure if it's growing. I think there's been a divide for some time now, where Russia really was able to rely on the likes of China and India and others, especially in the global South, where nations often look a little bit more favorably towards Russia, or at least just say, hey, it's not our fight. You know, the West problems are our problems. We just want to stay out of it. I think that's a mistake for countries like India. I think the democratic world really has to rally against this type of naked aggression. And a world where countries can do this to their neighbors isn't a good system for anybody.
All right, Foundation for Defense of Democracy's John Hardy, we appreciate your time and expertise. Have a great night. The spark that ignited revival on a Christian campus. When we come back, how the movement is spreading across the nation. And welcome back. The head of the Southern Baptist Convention is weighing in on the decision to boot one of its largest and well-known churches over ordaining women. The SBC's executive committee labeled Saddleback Church, quote, not in friendly cooperation, effectively kicking the California congregation out of the country's largest Protestant denomination due to lead pastor Andy Wood's wife, Stacy, operating in the role of teaching pastor. SBC President Bart Barber tweeted the executive committee's action is, quote, not final and can be appealed. No word yet on whether Saddleback Church, founded by Rick Warren, will appeal the decision. Well, tonight, the Asbury Revival has moved off campus and into the community with the goal of spreading a nationwide move of God. It's a strategy styled after a similar wave in 1970 that helped spark the Jesus Revolution. CBN's Wendy Griffith interviewed people who joined in the worship, including some who came back 50 years later for another taste.
When I walked in those doors, it was almost like 53 years hadn't passed. The same spirit just washed over me.
As an 18-year-old high school senior, Reverend Jim McElrath was working as a janitor at Asbury when revival broke out on that snowy morning, February 3rd, 1970.
It's just blessed everybody. I'm not kidding you, the greatest outpouring of God's love and the Holy Spirit, and I can't express it. I tell you, I'm just amazed.
The spirit of worship, the attitude, the people there lifting their hands in praise, people kneeling around the altar, just nobody really leading. The Holy Spirit led. I didn't feel anything different than I felt that morning when I walked in 1970.
A large church pastor make a confession and his wife, and that opened the door that if a pastor of a large church had something to confess, we all had something to confess.
76-year-old Harold Rainwater has been the mayor of Wilmore, Kentucky for 47 years. He also heads up Asbury's equine program that teaches students the art of horse training. But in 1970, Harold owned Dynamite, a restaurant right next to Hughes Auditorium that featured the best honey buns in town. One day, he noticed the students didn't show up to get their honey buns.
I really was frustrated, to be honest with you. I hate to say that, but I thought, I'm going to lose $100, you know. And I didn't really realize what was happening, until later.
Although Harold didn't have a profound encounter with the Lord back then, he still gets emotional talking about his grandfather, who came to Asbury in the 1940s.
He was a blacksmith working on horses, and they needed a stoker for the fire here at Asbury because they had coal then. So the goal for him was to come here and keep students warm. And because he was a fire builder, and he rang the bell at the church. And so he told my dad, build a fire and ring the bell.
In 1970, there was no social media to help spread the word. News, however, spread quickly. And just like back then, the revival made national headlines.
So my understanding is this began in a completely conventional service, and a boy got up and started talking about his own flaws, and then something changed in the atmosphere and it never ended. Is that fair?
That's completely what happened.
Last Saturday, the lawn in front of Hughes Auditorium was covered with thousands of people from all over the country, and some from as far away as Brazil, kneeling and praying. No one seemed to care they weren't inside.
It's been 53 years since the last great move of God swept through Asbury, and this time the revival is even bigger than before. All you have to do is open the door.
Evangelist Rick Curry, who grew up about 30 miles from Wilmore, says God told him this kind of outpouring was coming to Kentucky.
Probably about 10 years ago, the Lord said to me, there's a move of God coming to Kentucky that will change the course of the land. And for the last 10 years, we've been networking and bringing leaders together, really contending for a move of God, for a cause of God greater than any one of us individually. And so we've just been crying out for that. So when this broke out, we just knew this is where we need to be.
The minute I walked in, I just had to stand still. I was just in awe. And there was part of me was thinking, maybe I should take my shoes off because I'm in the presence of the Lord.
26-year-old grad student Meg Helton thought she'd missed her chance to see a revival on campus when it didn't happen 3 years ago during the 50th anniversary.
I ended up being there for 8 hours thinking I didn't care about what the time was. I just knew I had to be there at that moment. I allowed myself to be vulnerable. I remember just being in prayer and just allowing myself to cry and cry and cry, thinking, okay, the Lord doesn't care how many tears there are because someday he'll wipe away those tears. He knows why I'm crying.
Student body president Allison Perfader calls what's happening here a supernatural experience.
There were a couple people there that I was surprised to see, if that makes sense, just like, oh, you don't really like chapel. I wonder why you're here. And so I felt something had started, and then we just kept telling each other, and then we went from a school to a church to a mission field in a week.
Seminary student Daniel Moye called this revival life-changing.
I never thought I would be a pastor. And over the past week, I'm not saying that I'm going to be, but for the first time in my life this past week, I've thought, oh, maybe I could be. Maybe the Lord's calling me in that direction.
Because I think you already have your first sermon.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I think so. It'll be a good one.
Harold believes this young generation has gotten a bad rap, and what they really need is someone to believe in them.
I think us white hairs have kind of got to get out of the way and let the next generation come on and believe in them and empower them. I want to instill in them that they can be anybody they want to be.
He sees the revival as proof of God's love, not just to Gen Z, but to all of us, and a chance to get right with the one who made us.
We're born and we die and we have a dash. What's your dash? Did you build your fire? Did you ring the bell? Did you make a difference?
Wendy Griffith, CBN News, Wilmore, Kentucky.
Thank you, Wendy. Well, joining us now is Keith Pepsney, Campus and Alumni Director for the Navigators at the University of Washington. Welcome to you, Keith. Let's just start where Wendy left off. You heard the gentleman in the piece. Why do you believe that God started with young people rather than any other generation with this revival?
Yeah, I think, in a lot of ways that's been the history of revivals is with young people, that their hearts are soft. they're excited just to go after it. And I think this generation, especially because of COVID, has been just processing all sorts of stuff, extremely reflective on what seems to matter and doesn't matter. And I also think that they're kind of tired. And so I think the idea of just resting in the Lord, it doesn't surprise me that people just stayed at that chapel service in Asbury for, just for days and days and days. I think that they were just enjoying resting in the presence of the Lord.
Keith, I know a lot of comparisons have been made to the Jesus Revolution of the 1970s, but I want to ask you specifically about the role of social media. I think on TikTok there were close to 100 million hashtags of Asbury Revival. What role did social media play in this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a 15-year-old, so I know a lot about social media. But I think the big thing is that in general, social media, students just scroll like crazy. They're on the hunt for just adrenaline. They're on the hunt for just things that seem just different than the normal everyday life. And I also think for those people that know Jesus, they're on the hunt just to sense that God's up to something, that God's real, that he's good, that he's wise, that he's powerful, that he's present. And so I think people they're searching, they're scrolling, and then for them to see that and for this, especially for the Asbury revival to have a lot of legitimacy to it, this doesn't seem like just kind of a whim. This is pretty powerful for this generation. So for me too.
For those who didn't, Keith, for those who didn't get a chance to watch last night's Prayer for Revival and Awakening, it was live streamed across CBN platforms. I do real quickly, in the minute or so that we have left, want to ask, you just alluded to it, that some are more cautious referring to this as a revival. They're saying it's an outpouring because historically revivals come with mass conversions and radical spiritual growth. I'd like to get your thoughts on that and just the timing. Why now?
Yeah. Well, we're in Seattle, so it's taken us a bit for this to get to us. I actually watched the video with our student leaders this morning and said, hey, I just want you to know this is what's happening around the country. And sure enough, it led to some powerful just confession of what people are lacking trust in the Lord in. And so, I mean, that spark is real. I mean, we're 2,000 miles or, who knows how far away from Kentucky that it's making a difference. So we're
Keith,
super grateful.
Unfortunately, I hate to cut you off. I wish we had more time, but we are unfortunately out of time.
Blessings on you, John.
You too. Keith Pepsney with the Navigators from the University of Washington. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Yeah. Take care. You too.
The humanitarian relief effort underway after devastating earthquakes rocked Turkey is Herculean, to say the least, with groups like Operation Blessing on the ground to help survivors rebuild their lives in the middle of untold danger. CBN's Brody Carter has this report from some of the hardest hit areas where victims now have to contend with a spike in crime.
The topography in Turkey, it's absolutely breathtaking. There are no words to describe how pretty it is here. Unfortunately, on the antithesis side of things, that's exactly how it is. Looking at the devastation, the destruction, and the death left behind from 3 separate earthquakes.
And trying to rob as much as they can. People is getting desperate.
Danger in Turkey remains, even after 3 quakes and numerous aftershocks rocked 10 historic cities.
There's been multiple earthquakes since we've been on the ground, so it got determined that it's not safe to stay inside.
We're here in the city of Hatay, the most devastated city recently as of Monday to be hit by Turkey's 3rd earthquake. What you're seeing behind me right now is the only road into this city. That means supplies coming in through this road have been very treacherously and also slowly coming into this warehouse, to Operation Blessing, which has now turned into a distribution center because of word of mouth.
The need is everything. These people have nothing. Most of them are living in tents or their cars. They have no hygiene products. Most of them left their house in the middle of the night because it happened while they were sleeping. They have no shoes on their feet. They have no socks. They have nothing.
IDP, internal displaced person.
And that's what's happened.
Turkish people are IDPs in this moment.
Estimates vary between 1 and 2 million people left homeless, like Hakan Hamaruku. He and his family now live in tents and temporary housing outside his dilapidated home. He's forced to stare at an unwanted yet familiar scene that has overtaken Turkey's beautiful landscape.
I threw my children and my wife from one room to another to escape, and it worked for us.
Tonight I'm making steaks. Oh, you're making steak tonight.
Even amid the chaos, Operation Blessing remains steadfast on its mission to help those suffering and share God's love with those in need.
We're here to help people first, you know, water, shelter, food, medicine, you know. But there's some people that has been asking for it. It's like, oh, you guys are Christian. Oh, can you pray for me? Wow. You know, so it's like, it's very powerful too. It's not meaning that they are gonna, but the seed is being planted.
It has been weeks since the initial earthquake devastated the region. Thankfully, Operation Blessing has been on the ground since then, and they will continue to be for weeks to come. But they will leave. And when they do so, they're hopeful that they leave the tools behind needed here in Turkey so that the people who are struggling and suffering will one day be able to thrive and rebuild their lives. Brody Carter, reporting in Turkey, CBN News.
Thank you, Brody. And if you'd like to help Operation Blessing's disaster relief effort, you can call 1-800-700-7000, go to cbn.com or text OBDR to 7177. We'll be right back after the break. Finally tonight, prayers for peace. 1 year after Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, setting in motion months of violence and instability, people across the world, touched by the war in some way or another, pausing to remember the lives lost. Earlier today in London, a prayer service at the Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral. Hanging from the ceiling, hundreds of paper angels, each representing a child killed in the war, a powerful and visual reminder to pray for all those still grieving. And that is how we close tonight with that reminder for us all. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you have a great weekend.